Hello friends, today I would like to talk to you about a rather underrated application of phasing moves. Now, we generally think of phasing moves as these kind of defensive, reactive tools. You know, if you're phasing an opposing Pokemon out, usually it's a passive act. You're on the back foot, you're trying to chase the opposing Pokemon out. And yeah, that is generally how they're used. However, they can also be effective offensive tools. Now, I'm not just talking about when Skarmory gets into a groove with 3 layers down and the opponent can't really hurt it, and it's whirlwinding around the opposing team. Yes, that's one example, but there are a lot of underrated applications of Roar, which I want to go over in this video. Skarmory itself, at least in the generations with the spikes, can actually get some creative use out of phasing as well. So it's not just about the Pokemon and the moveset with the phasing, but how you use it as well. So we're going to get into that. So this is generally a more old-gen centered idea, simply because in the earlier generations, Pokemon don't have as many offensive tools, you know, not as many high base power attacks, not so much coverage, not so many options for boosting. And Roar can kind of act as an in-between for a lack of those things. It can generate its own pressure alongside hazards, of course. But I think the idea is pretty universal, simply because, as we're going to see in some generations, then certain Pokemon really rely on not switching in, or switching in and then switching immediately back out. Like, they can't come in and stay in, come in and or stay in, let's say, with impunity, because they have to stay alive, or they have to not make a move until an opposing Pokemon is sufficiently weakened or taken out. And we'll get into examples in case that sounds too abstract. But in those situations where an opposing Pokemon really can't switch in, and you have a phasing move, then you can potentially drag them in and really mess up their game plan. And there are several examples. We're not going to go over every single Pokemon that can viably use a phasing move in Gens 2 through 6. That would be ridiculous, but I want to highlight some of the interesting uses of phasing moves in these gens. So we're starting with Gsc Whirlwind Zapdos. It's not really an obscure set or even an underrated set. It's just that Rest Hawk is the standard on Zapdos, and anything that deviates from that can be pretty interesting. And Whirlwind is great because Zapdos beats nearly everything, and there aren't very many things that switch into Zapdos safely. And when an opposing player has that counter to Zapdos, then they are obligated to switch to it, so you Whirlwind and free 12%. Pokemon is very often a game of inches or centimeters, and every little bit of chip damage counts. And even if you do something like, with Zapdos, let's say, even if you do something like Whirlwind in a Fortress, and it takes 12.5 from spikes and then heals back 6.25 from leftovers, so you've only done, or only, in quotes, you've only done 6.25% to it total. That can be huge. So every little bit of chip damage is really, really big when breaking down an opposing team, especially defensive cores, but even against offensive teams when they really need a certain Pokemon to be at or above a certain range to be able to take a certain hit, then phasing moves can be a really big deal. So Whirlwind Zapdos causes a lot of havoc. Like, if you keep whirlwinding in Cloyster over and over again, obviously you have to mix up your moves. You have to be smart. You can't just, whirlwind a Cloyster and let it boom on you. Which is why I often enjoy Thunderbolt in the last slot here, or just over Thunder, depending, so it can't try and say, well, either gonna phase or the Thunder's gonna miss, but obviously you can't just click phasing move to win. It's not that simple. But having the option is really cool, because suddenly your opponent is thinking, well, do I switch to my counter, or do I stay in and hope that my opponent tries to phase me out? And when your opponent can't even safely switch to their counter, then and still has to deal with your Pokemon. It's not like you are trying to double switch to answer their switch to a counter. So to give you a concrete example, I have Zapdos versus Skarmory, and my opponent has Raikou, and I have Spikes down. And with Whirlwind, I can switch, I can rack up damage on the Raikou, Spikes damage on the Raikou, and my Zapdos is still in and still attacking, as opposed to having to double switch, as opposed to having to go to my Nidoking, for example. So it's really, when you can limit how much you have to switch, then your opponent, in order to really threaten your opponent, then that's part of what makes these moves so great. One of many, many reasons, as I'm sure you have already gleaned. So, Whirlwind Zapdos, I mean, Raikou, Snorlax don't like switching in with Spikes up anyway, but with Whirlwind it really gets pretty bad pretty fast, because a free 12.5 in Gsc is huge. And yeah, you're going to have to chain a couple of these. It's not like one Whirlwind and the opposing team falls apart. In later gens, where there are multiple layers of spikes and, you know, permanent sand and stealth rock and all that, then a phasing move is a decently powerful offensive attack, you know, dealing upwards of, you know, 25, 30, maybe even more. But any bit of chip damage can be really huge, because when you're trying to, especially in the early gens, because it goes back to that whole thing about how there's not as many options for sheer power, so you kind of have to use more finesse. I'm not saying that the newer gens don't have finesse, don't get me wrong. As a matter of fact, I think that phasing moves in newer gens, newer meaning like still Gen 6 for me because I'm old, but I think, and I'm sure in Sun and Moon as well, there are definitely some applications for those more experienced in the tier. But my overall point being that just because there are more options for dealing damage in the newer gens doesn't mean that you can't still use the phasing moves to great effect. Alright. So, that was a disaster. Let me try again. Just because you have more options for power doesn't mean you still can't get a lot out of the phasing moves. Simply because you don't just have to brute force or set up or, you know, taunt or whatever. Just forcing your opponent to switch to something else. Because here's another application. When I phase out the Raikou with my Zapdos here, and this is going to count across any gen post RBY, that when I phase out the Raikou with my Zapdos, I'm not just getting 12.5% on that Raikou, I'm also dragging in another Pokemon that's taking hazard damage, or Spikes damage in this case, and racking up damage there. And then they probably have to switch again, and then I get in a groove, and then then you see how that can snowball. So we go back to the 6.25% on Fortress. If I Whirlwind with Zapdos, and I get 12.5 on Raikou, and 6.25 on Fortress, and my Zapdos is still in a position to really threaten the opposing team, that's a great turn. I just damaged 2 Pokemon in one turn. That's why phasing moves are so, well, one of the many reasons why offensively used phasing moves are so great. And of course, when you have these phasing moves, then you're not just necessarily using them as an offensive tool, you also have the option to use them defensively. So I wouldn't recommend using Whirlwind Zapdos as your, you know, Curse, Sleep Talk, Snorlax counter or anything, because then you're gonna it's gonna roll double edge and you'll die. But it's certainly a good option for things like that and Machamp and you know, a super boosted resting Vaporeon or something. Yeah, so it gives you a lot of flexibility. So again, in these earlier gens, you are kind of splitting the difference with your lack of coverage and boosting moves and whatnot. And it's also nice to have as a defensive tool, especially against like some funny stuff like Baton Pass. But even in the generations where there are more forms of passive damage, then it can still be a great tool. Simply because forcing another Pokemon to switch in and take hazard damage is really, really nice. And while you're doing that, you're forcing your counter to come into you again with more hazard damage. So, you know, Raikou taking an extra 12.5, that means the next time Raikou switches in, it's taken 25% before you even get to hit it with an attack. And if you phased again, then more and more issues. And so phasing moves in Gsc, especially with Thief support when you're stealing the opposing team's leftovers, it can be really, really brutal. So that's Zapdos for you. The next one I want to go over is Tyranitar. And Tyranitar is awesome because it combines Roar with Pursuit. So this is going to apply to Gen 3 as well. So a lot of Pokemon will not want to Ghosts in particular, the Pursuit-y Pokemon, then they kind of are wary about letting T-Tar in for free to trap them. Missy and Gengar tend to check for it. And, yeah, sometimes T-Tar can run into difficulties pulling a successful trap off if it's switching into those Pokemon. However, if you drag that opposing Pokemon in and get a free 6.25 on them because it's taking spikes when it's roared in, then you have the one-on-one and they can't do anything about it. They have to fight that one-on-one, try to escape the trap somehow right then and there. They're not ready for it. You're dictating the terms. So let's say I have a T-Tar and my opponent has a Zapdos, and they're going to go to, Machamp or, Rhydon or whatever, and I roar and I bring in their Ghost or their Exeggutor, and suddenly I didn't even have to fight to get T-Tar in for that trap. Not only did I chip their Machamp or Rhydon or whatever with spikes, but I also got that Pokemon that I was trying to trap in without any effort. Now I'm starting out at higher health than they are, and I'm not switching in. Every single turn in Pokemon is crucial, and that makes all the difference. Obviously T-Tar can still pull off the trap if it switches into those Pokemon, if you play it well, but being able to start out like that in the one-on-one is really, really huge. And what's really cool about Gsc Roar Pursuit T-Tar is that depending on your moveset, you get to trap some other Pokemon as well. And I believe I talked about this in my Pursuit video, so if you want, you can go consult that. But one of the really cool things about it is that you can run Fire Blast or Flamethrower, and that lets you trap something like Fortress or even Skarmory. And what's really cool about Fortress in particular, Skarmory, you phase it in, you chip it with Pursuit, that's a lot more slow acting because Skarmory doesn't get hit by spikes. But in games where you're trying to wear down the Fortress because it threatens to rapid spin your spikes, then you roar in the Fori, you get that 6.25% on it, and then rather than roar it again and only move 6.25% at a time, you get to Pursuit it and chip it. So let's take a look at how much that Pursuit chip is doing to a Fortress without Hidden Power Fire. Let's just assume it has max bulk. So Pursuit on the Switch does, that 16 to 18 or to 18.9. That's pretty nice. So you're doing over well over 20% to Fori just for having dragged it in with Roar. That's really cool, and that's a big edge. And then you can do that sort of thing again later. It's obviously not your only tool you should have against a Fortress, but it's just another application of Roar and giving you these kind of creative options to break down defense in conjunction with hazards. Being able to drag in that Fori and trap it over and over means not only you're taking away one of their 6 pokes a little bit at a time, but your spikes that are pressuring the opposing team are being even more protected. So now, that's if you're running Fire Blast or Flamethrower, which is also good for Exeggutor, and of course you can also run a Crunch for Misdreavus and Gengar. But the other move that I really love on T-Tar is Earthquake, because it actually is your strongest move against Gengar if you want to trap it one-on-one. But the main thing that Earthquake does is that it lets you trap Raikou. You're not, OHKOing it or anything. Far from, because remember, in Gens 2 and 3, Pursuit is special. But, once you have Earthquake, then Raikou goes from, actually being a pretty good T-Tar switch to, not wanting any part of T-Tar. So this is entirely unique because there are not a lot of Pokemon that really can roar in Raikou and, and scare it out. And we'll go over some of the few that can after T-Tar, but there's certainly one of the reasons that is because Raikou, like Zapdos, matches up against so much of the tier. It's why Raikou itself is such a good phaser. However, there is no other Pokemon that can roar Raikou in, threaten it out, and then Pursuit trap it afterwards. That is incredibly unique. And when you're trying to bust through that Raikou with your Zapdos or whatever, and then you have the option to chunk it like this. A switch Bristol Pursuit. That's how I talk now. Let's call it 22 to 26 roughly. Plus the 6.25 from spikes when it because you're dragging it in. Raikou isn't switching into T-Tar; it's being dragged in. So 22 to 26, you can do upwards of 30 potentially, and that's crazy to be able to chunk it for that much. I mean, this doesn't sound like a lot, but remember what generation it is. In GSC, that can be a lot. Obviously, as we move through the generations and attacks get stronger and there's more passive damage, then when you're messing around with Roar, then the percentages are going to increase. We're starting small because this is GSC. Yeah, so that's really cool in that regard. And you know what you could also do? If you're running Sandstorm T-Tar, it's kind of gimmicky, but you can roar around and force more damage on everything that way, because in GSC, Sand does 12.5 rather than 6.25, so it does 6.25 more than lefties. So you could phase in Zapdos and have it lose health, stuff like that. Kind of gimmicky, but yeah, mostly stick with the Pursuit stuff for T-Tar. Either way, really, really cool Pokemon. And you can even do cool stuff against it, like you think Machamp's gonna switch in and take advantage of you and get a curse up. Whoops, you just roared out the Machamp, free 12.5, and that's going to, 12.5% really doesn't sound like a lot, but then that means your Zapdos is guaranteed going to 2-KO KO with Thunder, things like that. It's going to even struggle to switch into a T-Tar Earthquake later on. Really nice for Chip. Alright, so another offensive phaser. Well, before I get to the other, offbeat phasers, I just wanted to mention Roar Raikou is obviously a great phaser if you can get it to agree with it. The problem, which if you watched my Cloyster video, in Cloyster and GSC, which I recommend you do if you haven't, that Raikou is often used defensively, and we're talking about offensive phasers here. Pokemon that can switch into their intended targets most of the time, and go on the offensive. And Raikou can do that. Don't get me wrong, it definitely can, but you can't really rely on it as a wall. So I definitely think Roar Raikou is definitely still viable in the metagame. It's a great set. Like I said, it matches up really well against a ton of the metagame, and it's going to constantly force Pokemon in and force them back out and then spread damage everywhere. It's crazy. It's like Whirlwind Zapdos, basically. You just can't use it as a wall. You can't switch it into Zapdos Thunder over and over, because then you're going to get forced to rest and it just gets ugly. So if you use Roar Raikou, I really recommend having some other plans against opposing Zapdos, because you're not going to be using Raikou as your primary counter to it. Anyway, so then there are other phasers like Rhydon and Golem, but they're not really offensive phasers, Rhydon uses Roar to beat Snorlax in a Curse War. So T-Tar does too sometimes, actually, but they're really more defensive phasers. They're not really using it as an offensive attack. What does use it as an offensive attack very rarely is Nidoking. So Nidoking has a great move pool, and even with this great move pool, it doesn't have a ton of power, because boosting items aren't as prominent in GSC either. So you can't say slap on Soft Sand and really have that Earthquake Sting Nidoking, or Snorlax. So instead, what you can do is Roar, because the main thing that gets in Nidoking's way is Snorlax, and with spikes down, you make it, comfortable switching into starting to, get a little uncomfortable, especially because Nidoking, like the Electrics, really scares out a lot of Pokemon. Great speed tier, great coverage. Thunder can be Lovely Kiss or Fire Blast or whatever, or Morning Sun if you really like. Nidoking has a lot of room for experimentation, so I'll just leave it blank. It's really up to you and your team. However, what Roar does, this actually highlights another really, really cool aspect of offensive Roar, and that is, even if this is what makes it really unique, actually. Even if your offensive Pokemon is completely and utterly walled, then you can still get damage out of it. And we're going to be looking into this in Gen 5, and especially Oris, actually. But even if your opponent completely walls Nidoking, like let's say you're running Lovely Kiss in the 4th slot, and your opponent has a Skarmory, and they will just switch it into Nidoking every single time, and you just cannot hurt it at all because you've already slept something else, or it's a Rest Talk Skarmory. And even if that is the case, then you can Roar, and you can drag in Raikou and wear it down 6% at a time, and you do that over and over and over and over, and then suddenly your opponent is like, oh, what is this? Even though I had a perfect counter to Nidoking, it still managed to wear down my Raikou, even though I never actually left it in for an attack. So that is one of the coolest things about Roar, and we're going to go over this kind of technique a lot in later gens. Because it's not just a matter of, wear down your own counters with Roar and Hazards. Obviously, that is one aspect of it, but like I've been saying this whole time, it's a very, there are a lot of ways you can approach it, and forcing damage elsewhere, like we've gone over, is really cool. So even in this scenario where you are entirely walled, this is something no other move can do, and you can, double switch, but what double switching to other threats can't do, not all the time anyway, is force in other Pokemon that are trying to avoid damage. So like, let's say that your opponent is has a Raikou at, let's say 30% or whatever, and or a little higher, let's say out of Zapdos plus Spikes range, and suddenly, and it's just trying to look for a good time to switch in and rest up, and once it does that, it'll be fine. But in that scenario, when you are phasing it around with your opponent's team around with Nidoking, even though they would never dream of switching a Raikou into Nidoking, it's still being forced in and taking damage, even though they have a perfect counter to it in their Skarmory. So this is another case of even when your switch-in isn't even affected by spikes, like in Skarmory's case or sometimes Zapdos, then you can still force that spikes damage elsewhere. I mean, you can wear down T-Tar and make it tougher for it to trap your Gengar later. And the Raikou thing is a big deal, of course. But I just wanted to highlight that idea, because it's really, really tough to deal with sometimes. Now, obviously, I'm speaking like Roar is the second coming here, and it is not without downside, because every moveset is valuable, and you're not just going to be able to slap it on every single Pokemon that learns a phasing move and have instant success with it. However, I do really think that it merits more exploration. I mean, not just in the older gens, but in the newer generations as well. So I hope it's inspiring you to try it out, because this is some really unique offensive potential we're talking about here. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up GSC real quick, because I just wanted to mention Roar Vaporeon. I think it's really cool. It's the perfect example of using Roar to make itself tougher to counter. So it also actually has some really nice defensive applications, because with Roar, it becomes a perfect counter to opposing Vaporeon, who could be pretty tough to check, and you stop Baton Pass stuff. But if Snorlax wants to get into a Curse war with you, for example, or Growth versus Curse, I guess, and threaten to beat you one-on-one because you're just not hitting it hard enough, you Roar it. I mean, it's not even that you roar it on the switch, although that's definitely nice. But you Growth, and then it comes in and it takes spikes, and then you roar it as it curses, and then free damage. And the next time it comes, it's going to be weakened, and you're already buffeting. I never figured out how to say buffeting, I guess, because it's a word I always read and didn't really hear. But you're buffeting it more, like it's buffeted by the Sandstorm. Now you're buffeting it with your +1 Surfs on top of the free damage you already got on it. So another really nice application of Roar. All right, let's move on to Gen 3. So we know the big stuff here. So I just wanted to mention, Skarmory phasing with a lot of spikes up is great, etc. Normally, I do not advocate for whirlwinding just blindly, because sometimes you're not always going to, whirlwind out a Magneton, and in most cases you would rather double switch or just get the spikes down. Sometimes you even wind up whirlwinding into the Magneton, and that's the worst. So, however, what I really like about phasing moves in general, and this can apply to Skarmory, it can apply to Bold Roar, Suicune, whatever. What I really like about it is if you're really not sure what your opponent's going to be bringing, then what phasing moves can do is, in non-preview gens, of course, then they might be able to reveal a really key Pokemon. And this is another example of, this doesn't even have to do with hazard damage, but it's another example of your Roar being great for making a Pokemon switch in that was counting on not wanting to switch in until it was time for it. And when it switches in early, then it's kind of ruined for it. Now, what that usually refers to is in gens like Black and White, when T-Tar doesn't really want to switch in because it needs its health to take on Latios or whatever, and you force it to switch in with spikes up with a phasing move, and suddenly it's in a really tough spot. That's one example that we'll go over later. But in GSC in advance, then I'll give you an example from GSC. I was playing a tournament game once, and I was playing someone who I didn't really know what he was going to bring, and he was a very creative player. and I was like, I don't really want to get caught off guard, so I, brought some roar stuff, and I roared around, and excuse me, because remember, it's a 20% chance to roar in any one of your opponent's 6 Pokemon. God, I hope my brain didn't just explode. Yeah, 1 in 6 chance. Yeah, 1 in 6. No, it is 20%, but that's because it's 1 in 5. Yikes. It's a 1 in 5 chance because the Pokemon that is on the field when you use Roar is not going to switch in, so it's one of your opponent's other 5. So, even better. So it's a 1 in 5 chance that you reveal any one of your opponent's Pokemon. And what happened was, I was afraid of the dangerous, unseen, unpredictable last Pokemon showing up. So I roared around early in the game, and what popped up but Tentacruel, which is incredibly dangerous to see late game in GSC with its sub SD set. And part of why it's so dangerous is because you'll very rarely see it coming, if ever. It's not something that is really telegraphed by the rest of the team, and that's part of what makes it so good. And when you know that your opponent's packing something like that early on, then that really helps you adjust. Having information like that can be so nice when you're trying to do everything you can to not get flattened by your opponent's offensive attack. And just because some players are very difficult to predict, and when you roar them around, then you are able to see, oh, that's what's going on. Because even just revealing one Pokemon can say so much about your opponent's team. Yeah, that's it. That's the general idea of what I wanted to say there. So if you're whirlwinding around with Skarmory early, it should be, I want to see what else they're packing. And it should be if you're 100% certain they're switching. Don't whirlwind against Metagross without a spike up, for example. Yeah. So that's really bad. Anyway, so that's Skarmory. So now we're talking offensive phasers. So we know the classics. If you know Advanced, there's Roar Jolteon is great. Moltres is great. Zapdos is a little underrated actually because it has so many other moves it often uses. But Roar Zapdos is great. So I wanted to mention a couple. Oh, Roar Swampert I've always felt was underrated, but great always. Suicune, whenever it can fit it, it's also effective. And so I wanted to mention a couple underrated ones. So Roar on Pursuit Tar, it's always been a standard, but I just wanted to mention it again for the same exact reason as GSC. And in this generation, then it's super concrete. A lot of what's it called? A lot of teams are really built around Pursuit Tar getting rid of Gengar. And, Gengar will... And this is exactly what I was talking about when I meant, certain Pokemon don't want to hit the field and then stay in. They're afraid of getting Pursuit Trapped, like in this case. And so, Gengar will not want to give itself up to a free pursuit from T-Tar. And now, I will say you got to be careful with the set, and I would recommend running Counter or Ice Beam in the last slot. So in case you roar in a Dugtrio, you can take it out of the game. Because you should be roaring, if you're at low health, then you're probably desperate if you're roaring with this thing around. But you should be roaring at full health, so a Dugtrio switch doesn't ruin you. In that case, you can, bait in Dugtrio and take it out. Unconventional, but the main purpose is when you have a free turn with T-Tar, you roar, you can scout the opposing team, of course, that's really valuable, and you see that they have, oh, that's a Metagross, and I roared into Salamence. Okay, that's a lot of great, useful information. I can keep it in mind. I can build a game plan around this. It gives you the information. A lot of players will say, "Oh, I, don't know enough about my opponent's team. I feel like I'm in the dark." And now with this, then you kind of get around that, and you have a great offensive tool. Phasing moves are just the best. Anyway, so here, you don't have to dance around. Trying to get your T-Tar in on Gengar, and oh no, there's spikes up, and he double switched on me, and now I'm in range of 2 HP grasses. No, now you roar in the Gengar. You don't even have to switch into a Will-O-Wisp. You roar the Gengar in, and you have that one-on-one you're looking for. And I mean, 20% chance to roar Gengar in. That's really nice. And it's not even like if you roar something besides Gengar in, then you're in a bad spot because T-Tar threatens out a lot. So. If you run, like, I don't know, HP Grass in the last slot, you can roar in a Swampert and then, chase that out and keep going. So, there are lots of options. So, but the 20% to get, I mean, that's a crunch drop. So, Yeah, dragging Gengar is just wonderful. Yeah, you can also run Protect. That's pretty good. Like if you roar in something like an arrow, then you can roar it in, Protect, and then go from there. If it so lots of options. I mean, T-Tar can really run whatever it wants. It can run Taunt, Thunder Wave, Thunderbolt. I'm just spitting out Rock Slide, or Earthquake, whatever. I'm spitting out random moves because T-Tar really is amazing. It could run Crunch Pursuit and roar and nothing else and still be great. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that use of it. And the last one is Roar Mixments. Now this has seen some use. Basically, people have been realizing that Mixments doesn't really need one fixed moveset. I mean, some people like Rock Slide over Dragon Claw. That's pretty cool. And I've been a proponent of Wish Mixments for like 6 years. But Roar has also been gaining some traction, and I really enjoy that set as well. With Spikes down, then you have all the usual stuff. Oh no, Curse Lack's boosted, and now I get to phase it out. Same with Roar Suicune. Just having a phasing move in general is nice for these kinds of dangerous boosters, which became more prominent in advance. Nice for giving you some options against something like a passing Celebi. So those are really nice scenarios to have it in. But Ments also is fantastic at using Roar as an offensive tool. For example, Blissey, Bold Blissey can still switch into Brick Break Ments. Not well, but well enough with Spikes down, and with Roar suddenly it's into a KO range. It's just generally a great move to have to rip a big hole in your opponent's team by roaring the Celebi or the Metagross, get some spikes on it, and now they're forced to switch out because you're going to roast them with Fire Blast, that kind of thing. So Roar Mixments, underrated set, good set. And I think that's mostly it. I do enjoy Roar on Charizard occasionally because it kind of mimics Moltres and it's less expected. But yeah, so that's Advance for you. Now let's move on to Gen 4, where Ments is super legal, sadly. Sadly, it is not before July 22nd, 2010. I do have the, I'm pretty sure, it might have been June. No, it was July. I'm pretty sure that Ments was banned. I don't know, it's been a while. Could have been June, could have been July, but it was definitely one of those two. And I'm pretty sure it was the 22nd that it was banned. Anyway, that was totally related, but offensive phasing definitely took off more in DPP because they're Stealth Rock. And unlike Spikes, then in Advance at least, then you don't have to run then you do have to run Stealth Rock on every team, and what's even better is that it hits everything, well, besides Clefable. But yeah, so there are a lot of interesting phasers, and one scenario that really made me appreciate Roar as an offensive tool is this used to be Stealth Rock, Earthquake, Ice Beam, Roar with a fully physically defensive spread used to be Swampert's go-to, and that used to be great set and all, but it was famous for not doing anything against stall. Or so we thought, and then I remember I was playing some teams. I was using some teams with Swampert, and they were fine against stall. And I really just needed Swampert to get up rocks. That was all I needed from it. But I noticed when using Roar, not only could it do that cool thing where it would drag in a Pokemon before it was ready, or reveal an unsuspecting or an unexpected last Pokemon. Here's another example of, remember how, not long ago, we were talking about how Roar can bring in a Pokemon, can wear down a Pokemon that doesn't even want to be hitting the field. It can, and there's nothing they can do about it. So in that scenario, we were saying, Raikou gets chipped by Nidoking, even though Raikou doesn't even want to switch into Nidoking, because Roar keeps dragging it in over and over and has to run. And this is exactly, Swampert in DPP is what made me think of that, because Swampert, well known for being useless against stall, and it mostly usually was with this old set, but it used to be that, or it still is, Scarf Tyranitar has been very popular on DPP stall for the past 12 years, and Scarf Tyranitar, of course, does not heal. Scarf Tyranitar is completely dominated by Swampert. And what happens is, if you get up rocks with Swampert and keep him up, which is not an unreasonable task, then what you can do with Swampert, since you don't really care about it against stall, you can just click Roar over and over, and you have a 20% chance of dragging T-Tar in. and you take 12.5% health off of it. And that's really big because it's not getting that back. I mean, even if they have Wish Pass, which not all stall teams do, then it's not like they're going to Wish and you switch in Swampert and then they're going to go to T-Tar. You know, it doesn't quite work like that. So what you can do, it's just the perfect... is my music still playing? Yes. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so what I wanted to say is that's exactly why I love Roar so much. In that scenario where Swampert is completely walled by like 4 or 5 things on a stall team, you can Roar over and over and you can drag in that one thing that doesn't want to face it. And then when you weaken T-Tar like that, then it's tougher for it to deal with your Rotom or your Heatran or your Latios once that came back. So it's really, really cool that way. And yeah, that's actually a great use of Swampert in Advance as well. If you're running a Roar Swampert and you're completely walled by Skarmory, and you Roar, and then you drag in their T-Tar or their Dugtrio, and you have your own spikes up, and you strip some health off of Dugtrio or T-Tar, even though you're completely walled. No other move can do that. So suddenly your defensive Pokemon is causing havoc on the opposing team. Not just because you're weakening your counters, necessarily. I mean, because if you Roar a Celebi with spikes down with Swampert, that's probably not the end of the world for them. But when you start wearing away at their Dugtrio, that's when it really starts to become a problem. Especially because they're usually not going to want to stay in. And then you can click Roar again and drag in other stuff that doesn't... Or, the Dugtrio again. I mean, you have pretty good odds to do so. And, they're stuck in that terrifying scenario of stay in and do nothing and die, or switch around and get phased in over and over and slowly die. So that kind of example in Advance and in DPP is perfect encapsulation of one of the many ways in which Roar is awesome. So some other Roar users, this set, Defensive Swampert hasn't been popular in a while, but I still think it's pretty cool. So Empoleon can do similar stuff on its bulky sets. It's a great user of Roar. Restalk Gyarados, that used to be the primary Roar user. Wouldn't use it so much nowadays. Roar Heatran, another formerly popular set. I do like this one a lot. Like, if you get some spikes up, I would use it with spikes, mostly. What was really cool about this Swampert was that, even with just Stealth Rock, it didn't even need spikes to be annoying. Obviously, with spikes, it became a lot better. But even with just Stealth Rock, then, chipping away at that Scarf Tar 12.5% at a time was really, really big. So, matter of fact, I liked Phazing so much with Heatran and Swampert that I made a few teams with Hazard Setters that did not invite Starmie in to spin, because Swampert is a much better phaser when you already have all the hazards up. When you don't have to get rocks up with it because the rocks are already up, and then you just start phasing around. And I used Protect and Roar, which is a classic set, and it was great. Same thing with Heatran. Because Heatran's a great Stealth Rock and Roar Pokemon, but when you have Stealth Rock on something else, and you can just click Roar with Heatran, and send the T-Tar flying, and then drag in the Jirachi or Skarmory and force them out again, and, click Roar more, it's a whole lot of fun. Heatran's another great example because, when Clefable is walling bulky sets that are they're completely unaffected by hazards, but you can still drag in other stuff that doesn't want to be taking damage. It wants to preserve its health for as long as possible, and you can take advantage of that. Like, for example, even when Heatran roars in something like a Suicune or a T-Tar with some spikes up, that's still great because you forced that spikes damage on them, before the opponent was able to position them, before they were ready to, really get the most out of them. And that can make a world of difference. Yeah, especially because you have the option to just stay in and roar them again if you really want to prevent them from getting out of hand, if you're willing to sacrifice that. If you're really willing to sacrifice Heatran. Hippo, good for similar reasons to Swampert, except it also has sand, so you can do really cool stuff like Dragon, Scarf Rotoms, and Infernapes, and even like Kingdras, and generally things that don't heal in sand, and force even more damage on them, rocks and the sand. It's wonderful. Latios, good Roar user. Not optimal because you don't want to drag in T-Tar as much, but definitely a useful user of Roar with or without Calm Mind. Obviously, Roar is also nice, like traditionally on Suicune in Advance, as a method of winning Calm Mind wars. That's why one of the many reasons why Calm Mind Suicune is so dangerous in Advance. But that practice has kind of died out, I guess. It's not really. I guess players nowadays just prefer different methods for dealing with Calm Minders as opposed to their own Calm Mind Roar shenanigans, because those are those Pokemon that use Calm Mind Roar aren't as common and slappable as they once were. I think because it used to be that Calm Mind Roar Suicune was like one of the most popular Pokemon in Advance, and now it's seen as a more specific. So, but yeah, Latias, good Roar Pokemon, and Oh, okay. So here's something I wanted to say about Skarmory. What I really like about DPP Skarmory is early on when you're not sure what they're switching is. Is it going to be Magnezone, Heatran, Starmie, Zapdos, whatever. If you already have the rocks up, which you should, because most of the time Skarmory's not going to be running rocks. It can run rocks, but it's not always going to. Then in those cases, that's when you use Whirlwind. So this is what I mean, like creative use of phasing moves, because it's not just directly, get damage in other places. Just having that early Whirlwind, that extra piece of damage, not only scouting the opposing team, but also just really throws your opponent off a little bit. Because when your opponent switches their Skarmory answer into Skarmory, they're usually counting on it using spikes. And, then Magnezone gets its trap off, Starmie threatens spin, Heatran threatens whatever. And, if you're not really in a rush to get those spikes down, just having that Whirlwind and spreading more damage early on can really, besides just the scouting part, just having that extra damage to work with before they're ready to deal with Skarmory, because odds are your opponent's team is not going to be, 5 Pokemon that can kill or threaten to kill Skarmory. So, you phase them around a little more, you spread damage, you maybe get another free turn for your Skarmory, and you threaten the same thing again. So, just using Whirlwind before you use spikes it can be really, really cool. And I have enjoyed that tactic quite a bit. So, yeah, Skarm is awesome. And, when you mix up your moves with it, then that makes it even better. That's just a Pokemon thing in general. Good Pokemon become even better when the players using them mix up their moves. Because it's easier to answer Skarm if it's just gonna slap down spikes every time. But if you mix in Whirlwinds, or there were even some guys who enjoyed leading off with Brave Bird on Skarm at certain periods of the metagame, and it could be really, really useful. So, Roar Suicune not as good anymore in DPP, I don't think. But yeah, I've enjoyed Roar T-Tar a lot. Not necessarily with Pursuit, but just for spreading damage, just because on rocks, protect sets that I enjoy, then, it's a great user of Roar, for the same reasons as all the others. Drag in those other Pokemon, force damage, similar to Hippo, in fact. Finally, right before we go into the lower tiers, Roar Zapdos has always been really cool. Zapdos is really hard to deal with for a lot of teams. It tends to beat a lot of Pokemon. So it's just like Gsc in Advance. Zapdos really is amazing. And, when you're switching your T-Tar into Zapdos and then you get roared out and then something like Skarmory is forced back in, it can, or similar, it's similarly good at pressuring Clefable, a la Roar Heatran. So, yeah, Roar Zapdos, sometimes that has a tough time fitting it into its moveset, of course, because it has so many moves it already wants to run. But Roar Zapdos, always been underrated. Very good, I think. Let me just check if I'm not forgetting anything from UU. I don't think Roar Raikou is great, although some players have liked it, but not really crazy about that. And then UU stuff, and not really, crazy. I guess Drapion has Taunt knockoff in Whirlwind. Unlike Hariyama, just has knockoff in Whirlwind, which is cool. And I do love Drapion. I think it's really fun, but nothing huge. UU isn't huge on phasers in general. Yeah, so, okay, that's more or less it. Oh, I forgot Nidoking, because Nidoqueen's an NU. Nidoqueen is a great Roar user. It's just, Nidoqueen is great at using Roar simply because it kind of splits the difference. When you don't have enough power or coverage or whatever, then you can use Roar, and, especially with all the passive damage that's now flying around in Generation 4, then you can really harass the opposing team. Nidoqueen roaring out Starmie and dragging in an Infernape with some hazards up is just the best feeling in the world. So you can you don't have to worry about predicting your opponent's switch in with your coverage moves. You don't even have to worry about not being strong enough. You just roar. Alright, so yeah, that's Nidoqueen. And now we move on to Gen 5. So Gen 5, Phazing kind of went, not downhill, I don't want to say, because that's harsh. Because, I mean, Skarmory is still great. But it definitely was less common. Because in DBP, then, even more offensive teams tended to run Roar on their Swampert. But in Gen 5, it became tougher to fit Pokemon with Roar. I mean, when Sun was around, the Ninetales ran Roar, just because denying setup is great. And that's always fun, but, Sun hasn't been good for a long time. But, yeah, so... And then there have been periods where Rocky Helmet Garchomp was really popular, and that ran Dragon Tail. And actually, that's one of the Pokemon I wanted to highlight today. Dragon Tail Dragonite, another good forgotten set for more balanced teams. And then there's Skarm, and then there's not really a lot of phasing options possible. I mean, I've enjoyed phasing T-Tar before, and I love Dragon Tail Slowking. It's one of my favorite Pokemon, all the way down in RU. But here's the primary use of phasing as I see it. So, first of all, just having a phasing move is nice. Oh, Heatran, of course. I can't believe I skipped over that. That used to run Roar a lot, and now not so much. But I think it should. So, here's how I see phasing in Gen 5. So, a lot of rain teams in particular, they really struggle against things like Calm Mind Jirachi because they can't phase it. And Sub-Calm Mind Jirachi. And I've also enjoyed Roar Keldeo, but those are not connected. Yeah, so phasing can be really nice because in Gen 5, everything is constantly walking on eggshells. The best example is T-Tar having to stay in pristine shape because it can only switch into hazards once and still check the things it's supposed to. The Psychics, Alakazam, and Latios most notably. So, what if you were to force that T-Tar to switch in with hazards up? And then, there it goes. It's then suddenly your Latios and your Zam become uncounterable. It's really the only reason it's not common is because it's really hard to fit. I mean, these teams are difficult enough to build already, and I mean, if you're not running Skarmory, in which case it's a go-to, unless you're running offensive Skarmory, then it's really hard to fit. But I do think that there's a lot of potential for it. So, first of all, Dragon Tail Dragonite, I think it used to run some really cool Dragon Tail sets in Black and White 1 on rain teams and outside of rain teams. This old set, it was like Dragon Tail Roost, Sub, T-Wave, it was gross. Nowadays, I would run Ice Beam, no matter what. You can't be getting walled by Gliscor. But, yeah, Sub in the last slot, T-Wave, Fire Blast is actually probably the best one. But yeah, so I think this set could be cool. It's tough. The thing is, it's tough to justify because it doesn't really counter anything notable besides Volcarona, which of course is notable. But and I guess Breloom. So it's still fairly on the niche side though. So, but I think it definitely has something interesting to offer. And there go the sirens. Anyway, so that's the kind of idea. The whole point is, and against rain teams, of course. What's the name of the game in Gen 5? Weather Wars. If you can chip away at the opposing rain, like every bit of them that goes towards maintaining their rain. So if you can wear down Tentacruel, trying to spin, if you can wear down Politoed, if you can wear down one of their threats, all that is really valuable. So Garchomp, the classic Helmet Chomp. Miss that set, but yeah, it's still I really think it still has a place, certainly. And of course, Gen 5 got a boost from Dragon Tail being added to the repertoire of phasing moves. So last move hardly even matters. Make it faster than Excadrill, I think. And from there, you have a lot of options. But yeah, it's a good check to a lot of annoying hyper offense Pokemon. And for the non-weather teams, primarily hyper offense, then just being able to phase, those teams really rely on the snowball effect, and a problem with them sometimes is that just because you can live a hit from them doesn't mean that you can check them. Like for example, especially defensive Gliscor can live a +1 hit from Volcarona, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to actually beat it one-on-one. It's not like Earthquake comes close to KOing. and that's where phasing moves come in. And you know, that's dangerous because it can either 2 KO you or it can go for another boost. It's really scary stuff. So, and that's another really cool thing about phasing. You can limit, a lot of Pokemon are really dangerous if they can get 2 boosts, and with Roar, then you make sure no matter what they do, they cannot get that, I mean, unless they're taunt or something like that, but you get the idea. For a lot of Pokemon, that you can make sure that they do not get those 2 boosts. Like, I had this tournament game, like 5 years ago, and if my opponent got 2 Quiver Dances with Volcarona, then I was done. And if and there wasn't really a way for me to prevent it getting that second Quiver Dance. I didn't have an OHKO option. But my Slowking had Dragon Tail, and I love Dragon Tail Slowking. I think it's so cool. And yeah, that's so in situations like that, then it's just beautiful. And of course, in Gen 5, you really have a tough time fitting it on a lot of Pokemon. Like, even Heatran has a tough time fitting Roar nowadays, but it's definitely worth exploring. That's why I'm making this video. So, Heatran can definitely be an effective phaser. Hippo's tough to fit, but it can be a great phaser for similar reasons. Use Hippo alongside T-Tar, by the way, not solo. Let's see what else. I've liked Roar Keldeo before. Keldeo is interesting because it's super stupid, but it doesn't have a lot of coverage. So I, kind of plucked that idea out of the early gens. I was just like, all right, you know what? Keldeo doesn't have coverage. I'm putting Roar on it, and it was actually really good for all the reasons we've mentioned before. Its counters get weakened by hazards, and you drag in other Pokemon that don't want to be switching in and taking hazard damage. And then the next time your counter switch in, then they're taking even more damage, even before you've hit them. I mean, that free, 12 to 25% can be really, really big. So, yeah, Roar Keldeo was very cool. Nowadays, I still think it's probably got something there. Colbur Latios, Finchinator was... Solwind came up with, popularized Colbur Latios this year. And then Finch had the idea to put Roar on it, and I thought that was a really cool idea, because that's how you really make yourself even, the most broken Pokemon in the tier. How do you make yourself even more impossible to counter? Well, how your opponent can sometimes switch to one of the few things that checks it. Yeah, that doesn't really apply anymore, and you're gonna, cause more damage everywhere. Again, damaging 2 Pokemon in 1 turn. I cannot stress how cool this is. Theoretically, I guess you could damage. No, I guess you... Okay, theoretically, you could damage 3 Pokemon in 1 turn if a Lander is U-turned on your Rocky Helmet Garchomp, and then you Dragon-tailed out the incoming Pokemon and dragged in a 3rd. But, that's... Although, that's reason enough to use Rocky Chomp in my book. That's a lot of damage in 1 turn on 3 Pokemon. That's crazy. So, yeah. Skarmory, obviously, I don't really think it's worth much elsewhere. I haven't really enjoyed Dragon Tail and Roar, especially Dragon Tail Tyranitar, and I think it might be one of the better phasers simply because it really it needs Pursue, and then the other moves are all kind of negotiable. If you have Dragon Tail and Superpower and you drag in an opposing well, first of all, you probably want Roar so you don't get unnecessary Rocky Helmet chip on your own Tar. But if you can phase in an opposing T-Tar and then chase it out with, your own T-Tar having Superpower and Chople, then that's really, really cool. So I do think phasing T-Tar definitely has merit. And, yeah, and Heatran too. Heatran's cool, because when you have a bulky Heatran, or even when you have an offensive Heatran, there's usually something annoying that checks it, and you just, even when you're walled, then you're causing havoc, because you roar that thing out, and it takes damage. And even if that thing still walls you, even if that Spadef Gliscor still walls your Mono Lava Plume Heatran, you still dragged in that T-Tar, that Ferrothorn, that Skarmory, that Jirachi, and you chased it out again. And that is going to make your Latios a lot scarier. And so, especially because they're going to have to switch out immediately afterwards. So you can maybe even do it again and again. So you can see how it can get out of hand. So that's, splitting the difference of, lack of coverage. Roar is this really... Okay, it is still playing. Roar is this really awesome, all-encompassing coverage move. That's kind of how I see it. So, let me just make sure I'm not forgetting any lower-tier phasers. I don't really think Dragon Tail Kyurem or Kyurem Black is really that good, but... Yeah, I don't think I'm really forgetting anything here. I guess Mew. Actually, I've messed around with Roar or Dragon Tail on Taunt Wisp Mew as the last move. Simply because, Mew annoys a lot of Pokemon, but then there's that one thing that just kind of stuffs it. And with the phasing move, then you bypass that. So, yeah, I think that's just about it for Gen 5. I'm not really... I think if you're using Zapdos, Electric move, Heat Wave, HP Ice Roost. Nothing else. But yeah, so that's Black and White. It's a really interesting case in Black and White. I do hope we get more exploration with the Pokemon I mentioned and, maybe some others. Maybe Roar or Dragon Tail Gyarados has some sort of niche we're all overlooking. It does counter Volk. Yeah, so that's about it. And yeah, so now we're going to clean up with Gen 6. Gen 6, okay, so now we have fairies in the metagame, and so that's why one reason I really like Roar on Garchomp. Simply because that whole thing about how Clefable is going to wall Tank Chomp forever and ever. Incidentally, if you are going to run Dragon Tail Tank Chomp, then I would recommend SD as the last move. It's actually really, really annoying. It used to be standard in the Mega Sableye days, but I still think it's worthwhile now because now you can Rocks and then later you can SD, and the Clefable that thought it was safe isn't safe, and you can Dragon Tail out Gliscor, and yeah, it's really cool. But if you are just going to be a full support set, then I do really enjoy Roar because it does that same thing where, yeah, they wall it with Clef, and then you drag in the Scarftar, free health on Scarftar. It's really cool in that vein. And yeah, what's really cool about roaring around stuff in Gen 6 is that, you have things like Mega Charizard flying around. So if you can, get up rocks and then roar that in before it's, before your opponent manages to get that defogger, that spin-off, that's really, really cool. So, yeah, a lot of cool applications here. I also enjoy Roar over Dragon Tail on Tank Chomp because Substitute Suicune is the biggest pain. And a lot of Tank Chomp teams really don't like it once it gets going, and Roar actually gives you a pretty good intermediate weapon against it, because you don't have to counter it forever, you just have to counter it, or, chase it out for a little bit. Similar application to Heatran, who we'll get through. Oh, and Sub-Superior, huge pain. Heatran, I love Roar Heatran in Oris. I think it's really cool. Again, coverage, different splitter, you just take that Rocks damage on Gliscor and, Roar in something else. You can mix and you can run it on defensive sets like Lava, Stealth Rock, Protect Roar. The traditional set. Also good for unsuspecting Suicune, but it's also great on offensive sets for who really want to wreak havoc. It's like, I can't have coverage for everything, but I can Roar, and that's what's really cool about it. And you can mix up. You can mess with Clefable, with Taunt, or Flash Cannon, or however you want to do it. But basically, Roar Heatran has a lot of really, really cool options. And Oris is also interesting because, post Gen 4, then you really saw the level of phasing go down, and this also applied to Oris. I'm not saying it, stopped existing or anything, but obviously things like Skarmory still exist, and Hippo sometimes phases a lot. But it is crazy how once we started getting more Landos and Tornaduses and whatnot, then level of as it kind of makes sense though. As the level of power increases, then you're not going to be phasing as much. But yeah. Oh, I did want to say one thing about Oris Hippowdon. Hippo. If you're going to use Hippo and Oris, and you should because it's great. It really, really, really should have Whirlwind. Technically it's better than Roar because it doesn't get soundproofed. And that was one of the cool, subtle things about Black and White 2. Because before then, Hippo could only Roar, and then after it could Whirlwind. So, now we know that all those examples about, even when you're walled, then you can be annoying. And Oris Hippo is a perfect example of that. Oris Hippo is perfectly, entirely, forever walled by the biggest pain in the metagame, SD Gliscor. However, Gliscor doesn't exactly threaten Hippo, at all. And with Whirlwind, you go from, even if you have Ice Fang, I'm not saying Gliscor can switch into you permanently, but then you're going to be walled by Skarm and Clef and, whatever. And even if you and with Whirlwind, even if you have that team that definitely exists of, 5 Pokemon walled by Hippo, then you can still get use out of Hippo besides just getting up rocks, because you can get those rocks up and then Whirlwind, and then you drag in that Scarftar. Hell, drag in that Mega Metagross and chip it 6% at a time. That's great. Every little bit of chip on Mega Metagross makes a huge difference. It's a huge threat. So things like that. So I would not go without Whirlwind on my Hippowdon. Make sure you can check Gliscor and Scizor and Volcarona all at the same time. Dragonite as well. So, on defensive Pokemon, it generally is, I'm not going to say always safer to have a phasing move instead of a coverage move, but generally the coverage moves can feel kind of wasteful, whereas even when this Pokemon is completely walled, then phasing moves still accomplish something. So, yeah, not a ton of other phasing in Oris. It's, not really a ton of options. I definitely think there are options. Like, for example, I am really interested in a Dragon Tail Superior. I really think that definitely has potential, especially alongside Knockoff. My god. That definitely, I want to explore that for sure. So, who knows what the set would be, but I think it has potential. Absolutely. Probably HP Fire. And so this is my... this is my initial test for Serp. I mean, maybe it's not good, who knows, but that's just the kind of thing I want this video to inspire, more playing around with phasing, because it really is underappreciated, in my opinion. And, yeah, I'm probably forgetting some. Oh, I did forget one in the earlier gens, but we'll come back to that. Roar Zapdos, you could probably make something work with Roar Zapdos for sure. I don't think it needs Heat Wave as much this gen. I mean, if you're really weak to Bisharp, maybe don't ditch it, but yeah. There's probably something I'm missing. Like, I don't really think you want to use it on T-Tar or Mega T-Tar. But I'm sure there's something out there that definitely could make use of phasing moves in a way that I haven't envisioned. And I hope this video inspires that. Maybe Roar and Pole. I would love for Roar and Poleon to be something awesome. I'm like Hydreigon. I'm a big Hydreigon fan. And I am certain that... that some sort of... Well, okay, no, I'm not certain that Dragon Tail or Roar... Actually, I would probably go with Roar, so, you make your life easier against Clef. But yeah, Roar Hydreigon could definitely be cool. I don't know what set yet, but I love Hydreigon and Oris, so I just wanted to mention that. So, yeah, it even has Taunt, my god. So, yeah, so there's more... Whirlwind, Roar, Dragon Tail stuff to be explored. Maybe... I think Roar Megalodios. I've used Roar Megalodios in Oris before, and I think others have as well. I think it's quite cool. That should get some more appreciation. Not really sure what else there is. Let me copy-paste the Roar. So let's look. Roar. I don't know if I'd use Roar on the Charizards, but, Dragonite, Garchomp, yeah, I mean... Who knows? And then Whirlwind? Yeah, so not a... Oh, Volcarona gets Whirlwind. I wonder if there's something there. Hey, someone go experiment with Whirlwind Volcarona, and also I'm really glad Snorlax doesn't have Whirlwind in advance. Or GSC. That would be nightmarish. And then finally, Dragon Tail? Dragon Tail. That reminds me. I'm not going to go into Sun and Moon because this video is long enough already. But when I was using a bulky Como in Sun and Moon, then I really enjoyed Dragon Tail on it for the exact same reason as Oris Hippowdon. Gliscor would otherwise wall it, and it'd be really hard to switch into because Gliscor is crazy. But with Dragon Tail, then you just kind of sit on it and you rack up damage elsewhere. I mean, you drag in something like Greninja, free rocks, and it gets chased out again. Over and over. So, yeah, phasing moves are just lovely. I can't say how much I love them. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's something here in UU. Maybe Dragon Tail. Crocodile is pretty cool, I think. Maybe there's something there. Who knows? We'll have to explore, and I will leave that to you. Okay, the last really cool Roar Pokemon I wanted to mention was Venusaur in Advance. Now, this is really, really specific. But if you have a Scar... Well, usually you're going to use Venusaur alongside Spikes. If you have it on a team with Spikes and Magneton, then I and UD also really enjoys this, and Gaku has really enjoyed spamming this. Then you can use Roar on it. And what's really, really cool about this, for the last move, you can run either Sludge Bomb or Giga Drain or HP Grass, depending on what you feel like. But you don't need HP Fire because you have Magneton. So the really cool thing about Roar is that with Sleep and Leech, then you make things you shut your opponent down so hard, potentially. Like if they have a bunch of natural cure stuff like Blissey and Celebi, then what you can do is you can sleep the natural cure thing and then roar it out and then sleep something else, and it is really, really nasty if you get into a groove with it. Because Venusaur annoys some teams like nothing else, and has a ton of great matchups against things like T-Tar and Waters, and has a very good speed tier actually, especially if you invest it. That's really fast. So okay, not really fast, but a good matchup against a lot of Zapdos sets too. It's great. So yeah, Sleep. This set alongside Scarm and Mag is really, really vicious. Can really rack up some nasty scenarios. Yeah, especially because Leech Seed causes a lot of switches, and Roar, and paired with Sleep, oh, it's just brutal. Okay, so I think that's more or less everything I wanted to cover, since I said the Como thing and now this thing. Alright, so that's more or less it. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was of some use to you. I'm glad I was able to get this out there, because if you couldn't tell, I really, really enjoy me some phasing moves. And I'm sure there's some I looked over, and I hope this inspires you to get out there and build some teams with some fun applications of phasing plus hazards. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was useful. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.